I have to acknowledge and admit that I am not exactly a fan of Paul. In fact, I find it a little odd that we call him an apostle at all, as the term is reserved for those who walked with Jesus when he was alive. And our friend Paul was not converted until after Jesus' death. It is he himself who gives himself the moniker apostle and claims to be untimely born. That is, he should have and would have been an apostle, as the definition implies, but he just wasn't born yet. Yes, Paul may be responsible for the oldest writings of the New Testament, and yes, he might be responsible for the majority of the writing in the New Testament. And he is responsible for some of the most arrogant, sexist, and classist writings in the entire Bible. Part of this may be attributed to the time that he wrote in, the culture that he lived in, and his belief that the world would end soon, so why make waves? However, regardless of his reasons, some of these writings have been used by others in extremely hurtful and harmful ways, and do not align with what we understand Jesus' teachings to be. The challenge of what to do with Paul's writings is that sometimes he also offers us beautiful, thoughtful, and insightful writings as well. So what do we do with them? Do we toss them? Do we keep them? Do we cherry pick from them? Do we try to justify away all the offensive pieces? Or perhaps, like President Thomas Jefferson did with his Bible, we can cut and paste it into a more palatable version. Yes, Thomas Jefferson really did do that, and you can order a Thomas Jefferson Bible. Interestingly, I think Paul himself gives us the answer. It is not Paul, after all, that we are seeking to learn about. It's Jesus. So we must ask ourselves not what Paul said, but where and how do we see the threads of Jesus within Paul's writings? Paul himself asks in part of his letter to the Corinthians that we read today, has Christ been divided? And obviously the rhetorical answer is no. But the question is meant to chastise those who are claiming to belong to different teachers. If differences are emerging from these different teachers, then Paul is pointing out that what they are teaching cannot be correct, because there is only one ultimate teacher, and from his perspective, only one way to look at things. To him, anything that varies from that one way is therefore false and wrong. He even proclaims that followers should not belong to him either. And he reminds them all that it is through Jesus that we are baptized. This is why he calls us to be of one mind and one purpose, because we should all be in the mind and purpose of Jesus. However, then Paul goes on and gets a little egotistical. And while he tells us there is no one person that we should follow, he then goes on for 15 chapters to describe the correct path. There is a lot that we get from Paul that we don't hear from Jesus, and that even seems to contradict Jesus. And so while we may appreciate Paul's call to seek the singular mind of Jesus, we should be wary of his definition. Unfortunately, we are challenged in our faith by virtue of the fact that our faith does contain interpretation. God himself did not write our good book, nor did Jesus hand scribe a rule book or an autobiography. All that we have are writings from people like us trying to understand the holy and to be faithful themselves. Even the Gospels, which seem to be written as first-hand accounts, are not recorded for some 30 to 70 years after Jesus' death, and most likely, say scholars, were not written by any of the disciples, or for that fact, anyone that was present for the events that they describe. This means that we are left in the mystery, not a whodunit, but what is it and who is it? And for that, we must rely on the teachers, the writers, and the editors of the day. But the reality is, how can the teachers, the writers, and the editors help without inadvertently, or perhaps purposely in some cases, including their own biases in what they teach, write, and edit? That is, don't believe everything you read. Bring what we call a hermeneutic of suspicion to all your biblical reading, especially to my friend Paul. Such additions of bias do not have to be malicious to have negative results. Thus, we must be discerning as we attempt to peel back the layers of our biblical literature to find Jesus himself. This, perhaps, is best done not through subtraction, but by addition. That is, to gather more perspectives instead of limiting ourselves to one. Perhaps, instead of just belonging to just Apollos, or just Cephas, or just Paul, we should instead read and be familiar with all three so that we can begin to see where they align and where they diverge. It's kind of like that old story that you heard about the three blind men and the elephant, each of them grasping a different part of that elephant and declaring that they understood the whole. One saying that it was a snake because they grabbed the trunk, another one saying it was some kind of fan because they grabbed the ear, and a third saying it was a tree because they held on to a leg. Each thought they knew the totality based on their limited encounter. But if they had taken the time to listen to one another and consider that they only had a portion of the whole, and that in fact everyone might be telling the truth based on their perspective, instead of considering each other a liar, they might have worked together and seen that what they had was not a tree or a snake or a wall or a spear, but instead the full picture of the elephant that was before him. Therein, perhaps this too can be our plan, to see the whole and to find Jesus' teachings. Not to do as Paul seems to suggest, to narrow down our input and consider only one perspective correct, but instead to expand outward and begin to let a more clear picture come into focus as each one informs the other. Brian McLaren, in his book, Faith After Doubt, wrote, "Jesus never said, 'You shall hold correct belief about the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the greatest and first commandment. And the second is that you should convert your neighbor who do not hold correct beliefs. And if they will not convert, you shall defeat them in a culture war. On these two commandments hang all the laws and the prophets.' Instead, as you know, the greatest commandment is to love your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, and with all your mind, and to love your neighbor as yourself," which is ironically where Paul concludes later in his letter to Corinth. He tells us that all things should be done in love. Now, this idea reverberates through all the writings that we know about Jesus, except the difference is that in Paul's version, love is meek and mild, controlled and limited, whereas within the stories conveyed through the Gospels, Jesus' love is bold, sometimes even brash and without limitation. This is the problem with almost any outside interpretation of our faith and of God. We have a natural propensity to want to control and to limit it. We want to know who's in and therefore who's out. It is as if our imagination isn't big enough to hold the wonder of God's love. We like things to be clear and sorted, but Jesus tries to teach us that it just isn't that easy. Now, Paul's letters are informative. They do help us to see some of the concerns of the early church, and they do give us a glimpse into their workings. But I think we need to be clear that those glimpses are from Paul's interpretations of Jesus' desires and not from Jesus himself. I will conclude by giving Paul a little bit of the benefit of the doubt because I've been rather harsh on him. I recognize that we have from Paul, he is not a systematic understanding of his belief in religion and faith, and it was not meant to be. Instead, he is not offering us insights into his teaching. He is responding to letters, communications from the communities that he founded, which are running into very specific problems in specific places. I.e., how do we apply love in this situation? finally, I am grateful to Paul's persistence, his perseverance, and his perspective, because without him, we wouldn't be sitting here now today. So what to do with Paul, or frankly, any writer of faith? I'm not entirely sure. What I do think is that we need to continue to engage, to struggle, to compare, and to open ourselves, not only to the historical understanding of Christ, but to our experience, to our community, and to our connection with God himself. I encourage you to read Paul's letters and to also bring that hermeneutic of suspicion as you read it. May God bless you. Amen.